Kaimere is a distant planet. It is defined by waves of life brought from Earth and set free to evolve independently in this new context. The indigenous life of the planet, swarms of microbes called magic by the people who live there, are what harvest Earth organisms and make copies on Kaimere. As the asteroid which concluded the Mesozoic never struck Kaimere, dinosaurs remain the dominant terrestrial megafauna. Arthropods are a clade of invertebrate animals with segmented bodies and hard exoskeletons. They must molt as they grow. Arthropods possess an open circulatory system with hemolymph acting as a blood analog that freely cycles through their bodies. On Earth, arthropods constitute as much as 80% of all animal species. Their diversity of species, body plans, and niches is even greater on Kaimere, given regular harvests, coupled with independent clades evolving on the planet. Due to the sheer scope of arthropod diversity, this episode is going to give substantial preferential treatment to arthropods without close Earth relatives. All arthropod clades on Earth today have representatives or close relatives in the known world, given how many harvests there have been in the past 15 million years, although many are restricted to the known world. Dispersal is quite easy for arthropods given their smaller size compared to vertebrates, but modern arthropods don't have any inherent advantages over native taxa, so the realms beyond the known world tend to be populated by a higher percentage of clades that have been in Kaimere for much longer. All that to say, just because I don't mention a given arthropod today, doesn't mean it's not present in Kaimere. I could either paint broad strokes and highlight unique groups, or I could spend an hour listing all the beetle genera of the known world. If you prefer the latter, this may not be the project for you. Arthropods were introduced to Kaimere in its first harvest from Earth sometime around the late Devonian. While tetrapods were the dominant large animals during the first dynasty, spending the first 100 million years in an evolutionary trajectory completely independent from Earth, beginning in the early Carboniferous, there was also an age of arthropod diversity. Some familiar clades, such as trilobites and eurytherids, remained much the same as they did on Earth, while others like scorpions and insects took to New World with a host of novel adaptations, in a radiation of body plan, niche, and species diversity. A clade of scorpions developed a semi-closed circulatory system and amphibious lungs which allowed them to more rapidly recover from a molt, and therefore enabled them to get large enough to compete with the dominant tetrapods, an event which never occurred on Earth. Their modern species are covered in an episode which I will link above, and we will learn more about the height of their diversity early in Kaimere's history in New Year's first episode, The First Dynasty, first episode of the new year. In general, marine arthropods struggled during the initial stages of the First Dynasty. Plants were erupting across the land, which up until that time only had colonies of unicellular life. And this resulted in massive runoffs of nutrients previously trapped or had been multiplied by the rapid spread of flora. The bounties on the land, which prompted the adaptive radiations emblematic of the First Dynasty, directly caused the coastal waters to be a death trap of algal and magic blooms. Bivalves, cephalopods, and trilobites specialized in detritus eventually made the waters inhabitable once more, but this took a lot of time, and a vast majority of marine life initially introduced to the harvest had gone extinct. Most of the Carboniferous harvests were to repopulate these stabilized oceans, which is believed to be why placoderms, initially so successful during the first harvests, did not make it to properly establish within the first dynasty. Though spiders had not yet evolved, or at least did not seem to have had much initial success, smaller scorpions also occupied these niches. Of the many present in the first dynasty, jumping scorpions are the most successful in modern times. There are only a few species still found in the known world, but Kaimere is teeming with them. While scorpions managed to do battle with enormous tetrapods, insects instead opted to remain small and dominate the shadows. Whipcraw appear to be the first clade of exclusively Chimeran insects to radiate. These amphibious insects are detritivores, capable of metabolizing almost any organic substance with their retractable, powerful mandibles. In the hothouse jungles and swamps, which made up around 90% of Kaimere's land during the first dynasty, these generalists of freshwater, soil, and tree were extremely successful. Whipcraw are still found in Kaimere's jungles and wetlands in appreciable numbers and diversity, and their appearance is largely unchanged from their initial evolution. In the first dynasty, Whipcraw were so abundant and specious that they comprised as much as 80% of the species in the intercontinental jungles of the era. Another Whipcraw clade is the shieldcraw, so named for their round-bossed carapaces. Shieldcraw are notable for having among the hardest carapace being partially mineralized, unusual for terrestrial arthropods. Though rare in the known world, presumably due to the ashes which hit so many clades in the known world after the dynastic extinction, they are much more common in Kaimere. During the first dynasty, a lineage of Whipcraw developed massive forearms. Some use these as fossorial apparatus, with some burrowing into soil, plants, or fungi as animal parasites, and the largest return to water as aquatic ambush predators and detritivores. A terrestrial lineage, the whip mantises, were predators specialized in basal whipcraw that persist today as generalist hunters of small arthropods. Crabcraws are whipcraw that severely atrophied their tails as they specialized in feeding on moss and tree sap. They were initially mistaken by the Great Library and Assembly as a type of conifer mite, a tropical cockroach which we will meet later on in the episode. Crabcraw are among the most abundant insects of Kaishel and Picardia, owing in no small part to being able to survive in stasis through the coldest months. Though they lack the complex social structure of conifer mites, termites, and wasps, they do tend to congregate in fairly large groups. They are in such abundance that they are a lot more insect specialists than we see in temperate and subpolar regions of Earth, where an entire clade of phoenixes are specialized in them. A lineage of whipcraw called gemweavers are believed to be the first eusocial insects, at least the first to evolve on Kaimere, which they did back during the first dynasty. They appear almost indistinguishable in modern times as their fossils do over 300 million years ago. They produce silk which is used to construct elaborate nests. This silk is analogous to that of silkworms, though having different organs for a strong core and adhesive outer layer means that they can be mixed at different quantities for a highly versatile strength and flexibility, which makes them more similar to that of spiders. Each species constructs a unique style of nest, often being an adhesive for foundation for sticks, leaves, and even bones, though some make their nests purely out of silk. Gemweavers have a single pair of simple wings which they use to supplement launches between branches while they make their nests. They could also speak to whipcraw being much more derived than their basal body plans might otherwise suggest. Perhaps they were descended from the most ancient pterogoats, and most lineages lost their wings upon arriving to Kaimere, or maybe their wings evolved independently. An independent evolution of their wings would support the theory that insect wings evolved from gills rather than a completely novel structure. A massive gap on our own paleontological record further complicates the issues, and genetic studies have thus far not cleared up the matter of whipcraw placement. Some think gem weavers may only resemble other whipcraw through convergent evolution, although they are usually found nested within the group. For now, the leading theory is whipcraw as a whole are descended from stem terry goats, and most lost their wings due to the relative lack of competition in this vacant planet, although this may change with future studies. Gem weavers were a favorite subject of the first children, who domesticated a marsh species in their crescent outposts and used their silk for a majority of their clothing. Many of these now feral domesticates can be found throughout the known world, with the most abundant and successful being back in the Siritic wetlands, where they have been redomesticated and are used in clothing, tools, and even construction. Several clades of flying insect either persisted with or evolved to tremendous size thanks to the lack of aerial tetrapod predators during the First Dynasty, at least in its initial years. Ancient relatives of griffinflies grew larger than their Earth kin did toward the end of the Carboniferous, and a group of six-winged insects related to the extinct Paleodictyoptera are now called tendrilflies. Both attained huge sizes. Unfortunately, heterotherms and other clades developed sophisticated gliding and even powered flight, so the giants of this age were not to last. Griffinflies and tendrilflies still have modern representatives. The most abundant modern tendrilflies are around the length of a human hand with comparable wingspan, and are restricted to dense jungles in Arvel and Nikar. They are highly acrobatic flyers for their size, though they lack the endurance of more derived insects and therefore must remain within the jungles. A diet of sap and nectar further restricts them to the jungles. Tendrilflies appear to have been the first pollinating insects in Kaimere, using a long proboscis to get fluids produced by some gymnosperms. This is a strategy on both Earth and Kaimere, which would go on to revolutionize insect and plant evolution, though in this early stage it appears to have been a supplement to wind and water pollination, rather than a primary means that we see in modern flowering plants today. The dire griffinfly is the largest of a clade that once contained the largest flying insects of Earth or Kaimere. With a wingspan of 12 to 16 inches, they are around half the size of the notorious Meganeura of Earth's Carboniferous, although they are much smaller today. Their forelimbs are rotated forward, aiding in prey capture, and their hind limbs are more robust to facilitate a launching attack. Although some live in the Siritic wetlands, they have been found in the greatest success out on the Hausa Prairie. In the eastern range of the prairie, annual flooding provides the nymphs with food, while the dry season sees them burrowing to endure stasis until the next rains. It can take anywhere between 8 and 20 years of molting, depending on the bounty of the floods, before they are ready to assume an adult morph, at which point they hunt and mate for a few years until death, although most are caught by predators before they expire of natural causes. Arthropods, or a similar genus of giant millipede, was quite common back during the First Dynasty, perhaps taken to the midst of the dynasty rather than its inception. Regardless of the timeline, they are abundant throughout the latter half of the dynasty. Many other millipedes have been reported in these fossil beds, and whether these giants went extinct at the end of the First Dynasty, the small clades have persisted into modern times. As the First Dynasty ended, swamp and forest became desert and fern prairie. This was the beginning of the Permian Dynasty, which ushered in a tremendous boost in arthropod diversity. These were not inherently more sophisticated, they were much better adapted to an arid climate, and therefore quickly dominated the native clades struggling in this new context. Mesotheli spiders and earth scorpions replaced many native scorpions, and whipcraw were largely outcompeted by a clade of flying, arid-adapted insects called gleesfetters by the assembly. The origins of Gleesfetters is unknown. They are winged insects and appear to share common ancestors with lacewings and mantid flies, which came to Kaimere during the Permian, though they may have converged and perhaps are a more ancient Chimeran lineage. Whatever their origins, they rapidly diversified, spreading across the arid remains of a once lush planet. The earliest beetles would arrive and thrive during the Permian Dynasty. They mostly were detritivores, picking up scraps of decaying plant and animal. They outcompeted many whipcraw, especially since beetles of the Permian were pre-adapted to arid conditions, while whipcraw became restricted to the last remaining jungles and swamps. Though there were marine crustaceans in the First Dynasty, these, introduced during the Devonian, were purged by the algal and magical blooms in the advent of the dynasty. The cooling of the Permian Dynasty not only caused a mass extinction that the proverbial clean slate for underdogs to rise up, it also dramatically increased marine productivity. While the lands of the Permian Dynasty were comparatively desolate, arid, and saw a massive turnover from whipcraw to Gleesfetter, the oceans erupted in an adaptive radiation. Crustaceans became highly successful during this age, and trilobites and marine scorpions nearly went extinct due to the new context and heightened competition. Although krill had not yet evolved, a similar crustacean called gra evolved, which became the prey base for Chimere's first enormous filter feeders in these cooler seas. Though not abundant today due to warmer seas and competition from new krill, they are still found in their greatest abundance in the polar seas and support a diversity of filter feeders. The Mesozoic dynasty saw Kaimere became warm and humid once more, and this triggered another turnover in habitats that the arthropods then called home. Many clades we are more familiar with today, such as wasps, true spiders, crickets, and flies, were harvested in their millions. Though these newcomers came with some advantages, the climate had not changed as dramatically as it had between the First and Permian dynasties, so theirs was not an easy integration. The Gleesfetters, tendril flies, scorpions, and whipcraw that survived into the Mesozoic dynasty did so with notable successes, even against this new competition. The breakout stars of these dynasties were the conifer mites. These were a lineage of wood cockroach that became eusocial, feeding on saps of the conifers, filling out the forests, covering most of the land once more. Although termites are also roaches, they are in the roach clade Solumblatodia, along with the cave and hooded roaches, while conifer mites are in the clade Blabberoidea, with wooden giant cockroaches. Although most conifer mites eat needles, seed, and sap, they generally bore their nests into the trunk of a tree, so can be a menace to loggers. Most species prefer living in a living tree, meaning they aren't readily a pest to houses, although some eat conifer wood, so will infest homes, and must be dealt with accordingly. The damage their nests can deal to a tree can sometimes make them easier for titans to shove down, and often increase production with regrowth in response to the pests, which make them further appealing to titans. Rotwood mites are plentiful and important members of the Titan Garden ecosystem, breaking down the many trees shoved over by the feeding sauropods. Conifer mites possess a mild neurotoxin which makes them hard to swallow. Some specialists, such as the pangolin lineage which has been present since the Oligocene, and the wood alverosaurs, as immune to toxins and therefore eat them with abandon, but primates, xenarthrans, bears, birds, and other eusocial insect specialists tend to avoid conifer mites. Conifer mites can often cohabitate with flower-specialized ants or deadwood termites without issue, but their ties to the Titan Garden, which makes up a majority of the terrestrial habitats of the warmer latitudes, means that there are far more of them than there are of these newer termite and ant species, which are comparatively rare beyond the known world. The dynastic extinction struck a mighty blow to large plants. Just as most megafauna went extinct, so too did many species of plant not capable of surviving in the harsh, arid conditions that lasted for many centuries. The turnover of the plant's crust in the flood basalt caused a nutrient boom and high soil pH, which favored a lot of angiosperms. This success was best seen in the known world, especially as harvests introduced a new wave of hardy plants adapted to open terrain, but the forests returned to the gymnosperm-dominant composition as titanosaurs returned to the known world from Kairul. Their gardening and fertilizing with acidic dung favored conifers enough that they continued to thrive, which increased the acidic conditions of the forest soil, further hindering the success of a lot of flowering plants. This disparity, with angiosperms dominating arid and open areas, and native gymnosperms dominating most forests, was also reflected in the dominant insects. Chimeran forests to this day generally are populated by conifer mites and whipcraw, while ants and termites are more abundant in open territories, and the few dense angiosperm jungles that remained. A more comprehensive story of the ants and Kaimere will be covered in next week's episode. Termites in particular thrive in open territory, with their towering mounds reaching their greatest heights in the Hausie termite, a species of macrotermes which evolved in Kairul and reached the known world with the spread of their habitat around 500,000 years ago. The congregation of millions of large termites in many neighboring towers has enabled the evolution of many enormous usual insect specialists, including the 600-pound Goliath anteater and the giant pangolin, which can exceed a ton in mass, all on a diet of a single large termite species. Bees, as nectar and pollen specialists, are extremely successful in the known world, especially in the forests and grasslands of Kajar. While the realms beyond the known world have many species, they are not as abundant or diverse as on Earth, due to the fact that acidophile gymnosperms still make up a notable majority of floral species. The boom in pollinating bees only came to Kaimere after the dynastic extinction, and it is assumed that if flowering plants are given the chance to fill out a lot of the niches now dominated by gymnosperms, the bees would arise to similar heights that they did on Earth. For now, the known world is where bees have seen their greatest abundance and diversity. A lot of flowering plants find success in directly partnering with a single species of bee, moth, or beetle, developing anatomy that only they can get nectar from, which means these specialists are more likely to take pollen directly from another of that plant's species, rather than risk going to an unrelated species that wouldn't make a viable offspring. Flies are also quite abundant and diverse in Kaimere. They first came during the Mesozoic dynasties and were pioneers of pollination symbiotes. While some competed with bees and beetles for flower pollination, the most successful would be the ones partnering with gymnosperms. This lineage would not do so well on Earth. Investing in gymnosperms proved a much more successful strategy in Kaimere, where they have far greater success than bees and outcompeted many of the tendril-flies in the niches, which may be larger, but are far less maneuverable. Mosquitoes and other biting flies are a common menace in the tropics. The Suritic wetlands are particularly rife with them. While diseases like malaria and Zika do not hit fortified immune systems of chimerans nearly as hard as they do humans, many mild versions of these diseases are still quite uncomfortable. There is legend of a virus which specifically targets magic that was transmitted by Suritic mosquitoes, but this aging disease only has ancient historic records, and some are skeptical of its validity. Though most flies are reviled on both Earth and Kaimere, maggots of two species of chimeran fly, the temperate sapphire and tropical emerald blowflies, have invaluable medicinal qualities. For the most part, the hereditary magic of chimerans can help their skin recover from all sorts of terrible wounds and ailments. Sometimes, of course, infection and necrosis can take hold. Unlike most blowfly maggots, which eat dead and living tissue, the maggots of these blowfly species are so specialized as to only take dead tissues that they can be set in a wound and clear any necrosis, and their saliva and excretions have sufficient antibacterial properties that they can reliably expedite the healing process, clearing any proverbial obstructions in the path for body and magic to do the rest. In addition, maggots of these corpse flies developed at a reliable rate such that an educated investigator can use them to identify when a body was killed. True spiders have found tremendous success in Kaimere. They are found planet-wide, even warmer coastal waters of Kaishel, thanks to efficiently traveling overseas on floating vegetation. In the folklore of many cultures, these web-making spiders are a patron of craftsmen and masterminds. Crustaceans remain in substantial abundance in modern times. They do compete with trilobites and marine scorpions for niches that they enjoy exclusive access to on Earth, but they are still found in appreciable numbers, especially in colder waters and the abyss, where the two clades are not as common. Many arthropods serve as critical elements of Chimeran diets. Arthropods are often concentrated with a lot of proteins and other nutrients. The magic found in all Chimerans makes their metabolic demands around twice as high as those of a human living a similar lifestyle, so it's easy to see the appeal of high concentrations of protein. While tellmead farmers dread the coming of locusts, Shu to the north see this as a time of plenty, and roasted locusts are a delicacy. Picardians often have a fondness for whip craw and often incorporate them into their cuisine. Resistance to conifer mite neurotoxin is high in the Arvelith peoples to the north, thanks to regular consumption. Perhaps no peoples have an appreciation for arthropod in their cuisine as much as Kaleen, who relish lobster, crab, trilobite, and marine scorpion, and other armored bounties of the sea. Although arthropods do not dominate any contest of size, their impact on the environment and ecosystems of Kaimere cannot be overstated. As the foundation of many food chains, situations which impact arthropods ripple up to the giants. They are often critical in shaping local ecosystems by processing the detritus, tilling the silt and soil, and pollinating the crops many Chimerans need to survive. Kaimere may seem a world of giants, but none of that could be possible without the billions of arthropods underfoot. Cheers to David for sponsoring this episode. It was quite an undertaking, and I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to study and better appreciate the success and diversity of arthropods. I've done an episode on housey termites and marine scorpions in the past, and I'm looking forward to my episode on ants and termites in the next 2 weeks. As I said in the beginning, covering a clade as diverse as arthropods means that I could only scratch the surface, and I'm sure I'll be back to these wonderful critters more in future episodes. Thanks again to David, cheers to my patrons, and thank you for watching. Cheers, folks!